All right, welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive in our Beyond Global Waves series. And today we're going to be focusing on, well, a pretty interesting relationship, I think, between the United States and their neighbor to the north, Canada. And we're going to be looking at two very different sources to kind of examine this and see what we can learn from it. The first one is going to be a satirical film called Canadian Bacon from 1995.
Okay.
And the second is going to be some events that have happened very recently in 2025 involving former President Trump and his ideas on Canada becoming the 51st state.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to be diving into today, and hopefully we can offer some insights into the dynamics of this sometimes I guess you could say, contentious relationship between these two countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating pairing of source material that you have.
Yeah.
Because we're looking back at a comedic take on this relationship from almost 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And then sort of juxtaposing that with more recent political commentary.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it begs the question, like, how have these perceptions of this relationship maybe evolved? Or maybe they've stayed the same?
Yeah.
We'll find out.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into the cinematic side of things first.
Okay.
As I mentioned, Canadian Bacon, it premiered in 1995. And Michael Moore, the director and writer and producer of this film, he's probably best known for his documentary work. But this was actually a straight-up satire.
Right.
Taking aim squarely at the relationship between Canada and the United States.
Yeah.
And in particular, that border that we share, which is often quite open. And
you know, it's interesting that Moore uses satire here because it allows him to take these really complex issues, these sensitive issues, and look at them through the lens of humor and exaggeration. It gives him this kind of freedom to critique and comment on the tensions, the assumptions that maybe would be harder to address directly. And I think the cast he assembled, also really noteworthy. We've got talent like Alan Alda, John Candy, this is his final role.
Oh, wow.
Bill Nunn, Kevin J. O'Connor, Rhea Perlman, Kevin Pollak, Judy Spradlin, and Rip Torn.
That's quite a lineup.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, the premise is wonderfully absurd.
Yeah.
So picture this. The Cold War is over. The U.S. doesn't really have a clear enemy. And the president's approval rating is tanking.
okay.
And in a moment of what you might call peak political brainstorming, one of his advisors suggests, well, what about Canada as the next, I guess, enemy to focus on?
I see, yeah.
And you know what's interesting about Moore's satire, even though it is exaggerated?
Yeah. It does tap into something that is kind of a recurring dynamic, I think. And that's this, the sheer size and influence of the U.S. can sometimes kind of overshadow their northern neighbor. And it can lead to, whether subtle or not, anxieties about, well, sovereignty. But of course, the film takes that dynamic and just blows it up.
To comedic proportions.
To comedic proportions.
Yeah.
So what is the catalyst for this manufactured conflict? It is a good old-fashioned hockey brawl.
Oh, okay.
In Niagara Falls, Ontario.
Right.
A U.S. sheriff, Bud Boomer, who is played brilliantly by John Candy, and his buddies get into this scuffle. It escalates. And, news footage of this hits American televisions. And all of a sudden, Canada's looking like, well,
Potential threat.
a potential threat.
It's funny how, a localized incident like that, amplified through the media, can be used to serve a larger narrative, even one as outlandish as, the U.S. needing to pick a fight with Canada. So I think the film very cleverly uses this to comment on the power of media and propaganda in shaping public perception.
Yeah, for sure. So from this hockey game dust-up, the film, it dives headfirst into this full-blown anti-Canada propaganda. In the U.S., and Sheriff Boomer and his pals, they buy it.
They do?
They decide they need to take action. They need to cross the border, which predictably doesn't go smoothly. And Boomer's girlfriend, Honey, who's also a deputy, ends up getting arrested by the Mounties.
And this is where the rescue attempts ensues, right?
Yeah. It's pure comedic chaos.
Okay.
They end up infiltrating a Canadian power plant. And in true farcical style, it results in a total blackout across Canada.
My goodness.
So, I mean, the absurdity of this small-town American sheriff causing such widespread disruption, it emphasizes the satirical nature of this film.
Yeah. I mean, it's really poking fun at these sort of tropes,
Of American intervention, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the plot thickens.
Oh, okay.
We also have a disgruntled U.S. military contractor,
Right.
R.J. Hacker. He's got his own axe to grind.
He's trying to activate missile silos. And initially, it appears as though Canada might be responsible. But of course, in the end, It's Honey who saves the day. She stops the missile launch by taking out a central computer in the iconic CN Tower.
Of course.
So eventually the group makes it back to the U.S., maybe with a slightly altered view
Hopefully.
of their northern neighbors.
I think it's safe to say that the humor really lies in this escalating series of ridiculous events, all stemming from this initial absurd premise of, needing an enemy and choosing Canada. And the over-the-top reactions of the characters, the sheer implausibility of everything that's happening. It's all key to more satirical commentary on nationalism. And, international relations.
Now, there's a couple of behind-the-scenes tidbits that I think are pretty interesting. You know that hockey game scene that sets everything in motion? It was actually filmed at the Niagara Falls Memorial Arena in Niagara Falls, Ontario.
Oh, wow.
And get this, the actors playing those Canadian police officers in that riot scene were wearing genuine Niagara Regional Police uniforms.
So they really leaned into the authenticity there.
Yeah, just a little touch of unexpected realism to the satire. So as I said, the film had a limited release in '95. It didn't break box office records, but it has become a bit of a cult classic, I think.
Right.
For its comedic take on this relationship.
I think for our listeners, if you're interested in this and you want to explore these dynamics further, Canadian Bacon is definitely worth a watch. It offers, as we've been saying, a humorous but exaggerated perspective on the potential for manufactured conflict. And, this kind of sensitive relationship between these two countries, I think it'd be really interesting to see how some of these points that the film makes satirically land within the context of today's world.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's fast forward now. 3 decades to March 2025. And we're going from this realm of satirical comedy to actual political discourse. And this involves former U.S. President Donald Trump.
Yes.
He has reportedly made some rather noteworthy remarks.
He has.
About Canada potentially becoming the 51st state of the United States.
Interesting.
And these remarks were reported by AP News on February 13th, 2025.
That's right.
And now Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, she has stated publicly that she believes these comments from Trump reflect a strategy to weaken Canada economically, to pave the way for eventual annexation. And this wasn't actually just a one-off comment.
Oh, really?
Back in December 2024, according to Yahoo News, Trump also quipped that Canada could avoid tariffs if they just became the 51st state.
So he's making this point a few times.
Yeah, so it's I mean, whether it's a joke, whether it's serious, it's certainly out there.
It's entered the public conversation.
It has.
Yeah.
And you know what begs a question, right?
Yeah.
What is the intent behind these statements?
Exactly. Are they purely rhetorical? Is he just trying to gain some leverage in trade negotiations? Or is this a more concrete long-term ambition? But either way, I think it highlights this complex interplay between political rhetoric, economic interests, and national sovereignty.
Right. Now, these remarks, they haven't exactly been met with,
I would imagine,
enthusiasm north of the border. And there have been some pretty strong reactions from Canadian political figures. For instance, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, in December 2024, stated quite firmly that Canada would never become a U.S. state, and that Canada is not for sale. This is reported by CNN. But then he also offered, Ford did a rather historical interpretation for the potential motivation behind Trump's terror threats.
Interesting.
He suggested that they might be a form of retribution for the War of 1812. This was according to Global News.
Interesting take.
It is. It's a very colorful way of looking at the current trade tensions. And separately, there were reports from Forbes that Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was expected to resign in early January of 2025.
Oh, wow.
Although the direct link to these specific comments about annexation isn't explicitly made in that report.
I see.
So let's try and draw some parallels between that satirical scenario in Canadian Bacon and this real-world situation that we're seeing in 2025.
Right, yeah.
One of the most immediate connections, I think, is this notion of the U.S. considering Canada in terms of potential territorial or political alignment, even if one is played for laughs and the other is more serious.
It's fascinating, though, how both of them touch on this inherent power dynamic between a large, influential nation and a smaller nation. The film, it's exaggerated for comedic effect, right? It highlights the absurdity of the U.S. needing an enemy. But then in the 2025 context, it raises these more serious questions about national sovereignty and economic influence.
Yeah, I think both scenarios, in their own way, underscore the importance of national identity and the distinctiveness that Canada maintains in its relationship with the United States. I mean, the film satirizes a potential threat to that, but these real-world comments seem to almost provoke a reaffirmation of it, which leads us to kind of a crucial element here, and that is the perspective of Canadians themselves on this idea of closer integration with the U.S., while political rhetoric, and these jokes might surface now and then, public opinion polls give us a good idea of the sentiment among Canadians. And we've got several polls from January 2025 that show exactly where Canadians stand on this issue. An Angus Reid Institute poll indicated that a significant majority, 90% of Canadians, said no to Canada becoming the 51st state. Only about 10% expressed any degree of openness to that.
That's a pretty decisive response.
It is. It is. And while, other polls might show slight variations depending on demographics or wording, the general trend, a clear majority, are in favor of Canada staying sovereign.
Okay, so those numbers really do highlight this. Preference for keeping Canada's independent status.
Yeah. It's also worth noting the historical context here. This 51st state idea in Canada, it carries connotations of a loss of independence due to political or economic ties with the U.S.
I see,
And while there were periods where annexation to the U.S. was discussed, particularly in the 19th century for economic reasons, these movements never really gained widespread support. And factors like loyalty to Britain, concerns about becoming a smaller minority within the U.S., differing views on the political systems all played a role in that. And then considering the potential motivation behind Trump's remarks in 2025, that CNN report, suggested a possible link to past business dealings he's had in Canada. And so I think it serves as a reminder that various factors, sometimes even quite personal ones, can influence international discourse.
They can.
Even at the highest levels.
For sure.
It's important to emphasize that as we're exploring these topics, our aim here is to present the information from these sources objectively without endorsing any viewpoint. We're just trying to understand the nuances of this ongoing relationship between these two North American neighbors.
Exactly. And, by looking at this satirical portrayal from the past and these recent political commentaries, we can get a much richer understanding of these underlying dynamics, these anxieties, these aspirations that really shape the relationship between the two countries.
Absolutely. So, as we've heard, the dynamic between Canada and the United States, it is multifaceted. It encompasses comedic exaggeration in film, but also these real-world political discussions. Canadian Bacon offers a humorous, if exaggerated, look at these potential tensions, and these recent statements have brought the idea of closer ties, maybe even annexation, into the news. But the polling data that we've looked at, it strongly suggests that the vast majority of Canadians prefer to maintain their independent national identity. So we hope that this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of these different facets of this relationship and perhaps prompted some further thought about the relationships between neighboring nations and that enduring significance of national identity. What are your takeaways from this exploration? Think about it. We'll see you next time.